whiskey.
No, thank you for that, Robert. I think everyone will agree that was a pretty interesting session. And I think, like a few of us in the trade, you're starting to lose your voice a little bit and go a bit dry there. It's a long time since we've had to do a lot of talking, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. I think because I wasn't doing the normal tour, because I think it would have been a bit boring, because the tour we do 90% of the time is pretty top line for corporates and things like that don't understand the whiskey making process. So I think, it needed to be adapted a little bit on the fly, talk a little bit more about innovation and less about how you make alcohol.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, quite a few interesting parts in there. One thing I would like to just jump onto while we're recording, and obviously some people may not know the difference. If you could just explain a little bit of the difference between triple distilled and double distilled of Scottish, because obviously some people may not get that.
Yeah, I think the easiest example is peated whiskey. That is probably the best way to describe it. So for Black Pit specifically, we brought in a malt that's 55 parts per million. So it's on the stronger side in terms of the smokiness. But every stage in the distillation process, you're going to lose that smokiness. So from milling to mashing to fermentation to single distillation to double distillation to triple distillation, you're going to lose some of the flavors of whatever came before, because obviously the closer you get to pure alcohol, you're going to start to get a more and more flavorless, lighter spirit. But the trade-off is that if you do it well enough, you can get far more of the fruitier flavors. So yes, you'll lose the heavier phenols, but you can really kind of start to tease out the esters, the higher bodied esters, like the pineapples and passion fruits during fermentation. So you'll lose some of the flavors of the mash bill, but you won't lose them all if done correctly. So it is a balancing act. So it is like you start with these huge heavy fusel oils and these lighter esters. They both go into the stills, and then depending on how you run those stills, depending on what kind of heart cut you take out of that, whether it kind of shifts, that midpoint shifts down a little or up. So essentially you can trade those off. So Black Pits, for example, we don't lose too much of the smokier flavors that we want, even though that is a triple distilled malt, but we do lose some of the heavier ones. So we do drop from about 55 parts per million to about 15. Obviously it's measured as when you buy the malt in, but yeah, I would say that from bottle, it's only about 15 parts per million.
Yeah.
So yeah, depending on how you run your stills, at what cut points, which obviously changes for us depending on what we're distilling. It just really depends on what flavors that you're looking to extract from that pot ale, that distillate.
And one of the questions from Simon was about the peat. So I take it is Irish peat, and
no, it's actually not. No, we're happy to say that it's Scottish peat. It comes from Glenesk in Speyside. It was purchased because of the fact it would have had similarities to Irish peat, but the problem is, yes, there is Irish peat, and yes, there is Irish barley, but there isn't a lot of peated Irish malt, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Because the malting house of Ireland, this big, there's a couple of them, but that's the main one. Because they're doing, malt for Guinness and Jameson, they don't want to potentially, because as you know, like you use peated malt even in the malting process or in the distillation process, you've got to get the flavors of that smoke for multiple runs after that. So they're not willing to gamble giving Guinness, tens or hundreds of thousands of tons of malt that has a subtly peated characteristic to it just because Teeling Whiskey Company bought 10,000 liters or 10,000 kilograms of peated malt. That makes sense. So they're not even willing to gamble it. We've said we'll buy, 100,000 kilograms. They're just like, no, we don't want that. We don't even want to take the risk. So we went to Scotland.
And so with the triple distilled is obviously forgetting the grain whiskies that you do, but is everything else triple distilled then, the pot still, or?
Everything we've released so far is triple distilled. Yeah. We've done examples. We've done, because eventually we will begin to phase out. So like the single malt will have to be phased out at some point. Some of the the Brabazon probably won't be released anymore. We'll have to draw a line under that series. So I mean, it is like that chef analogy. You need to make the flavors before you can start to play with the flavors. You need to make the ingredients before you start to use them as ingredients. So yeah, we've double and triple distilled. But yeah, I mean, we just haven't found a home for any of the double distilled stuff yet, and we're doing far more triple distilled anyway.
And one thing within there, so obviously you do produce a grain whiskey as well. So is the grain whiskey distilled in? Is it made on site, or do you buy that in?
We buy that in from a man named John Teeling. John Teeling owns the Great Northern Distillery up in Dundalk. So the father of Jack and Stephen Teeling, he makes whiskey for other people. He's one of the biggest grain whiskey suppliers in Ireland. He supplies grain to a lot of the newer whiskey companies, so we get a great deal from him. We get to tell him the specifications of the grain that we want. We will hopefully have a subsequent grain whiskey, but for the time being, that single grain has just done remarkably well for us. We've just not kind of tried to influence that in any way. I mean, it continues to win awards. It continues to win, best Irish grain at the Irish Whiskey, the World Whiskey Awards. It just recently won it again. So it's been a great example. We haven't really wanted to kind of test the waters there, but I think now that we've established the Dublin distillery, we can go back to kind of, picking up grain from elsewhere. Because that's the question. Like, everyone thinks they're catching you out with that one. Like, oh, grain isn't made in Dublin. Where are you getting it? We haven't signed non-disclosure agreements or anything like that, because we buy it from John Teeling. It's still in the family. It's still family stock. John is invested in Teeling whiskey. The family's invested in GND, so there's a close relationship there. It's not something we're trying to hide. We just don't choose to talk about it. If you've got 30 minutes to talk with someone, you're not going to sing the praises of someone else's company. You're going to talk about the good things that you do.
And so jumping backwards a little bit, where, like I mentioned earlier, I'm drinking the single malt that you've got. And I think, did you say the distillery was operational in 2015?
Yep.
So the bottle I've got here was October 2018. So will that be produced at your distillery, or?
Is it this? Is it this bottle? Yeah, no. So the malt in that is still like 9 years old minimum.
Right.
Probably older at this point, because it all came from somewhere else, from the family's previous distillery. We are looking at a Dublin distilled product, but as it stands, the only whiskies that you can get that contain Dublin distillate is the Black Pits, the pot still, and the malt component of small batches from Dublin now.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because so when you say obviously it was bought from elsewhere, are we allowed to, is it something you disclose, or?
We just, we don't get too drawn into that. We just say the family's previous stock.
Yeah.
Because again, it would have all been bought from one warehouse. But yeah, you don't go into detail about where exactly it came from.
Yeah. So jumping back then, so obviously the family have a bit of a history with whiskey. We've known the Teeling name for quite some time. Do you want to just give us a sort of more brief, not a brief, but a more, chat about where they started and what made them start the distillery of their own then?
Yeah, of course. So they both grew up in finance. John Teeling opened the Cooley distillery in the 1980s. He reopened Kilbeggan, but obviously in 2010 or so, they were sold to Beam Suntory. 2011, I think the final deal went through. But at that time, Jack had just taken over. At the time, Jack Teeling was in finance and wasn't going to follow in his father's footsteps, but was kind of going through a bit and just went, you know what, I'll go and work at Cooley for a bit. fell in love with the whiskey industry, completely stopped in the finance world. Same with Stephen, completely stopped working in finance, started running Cooley, and then like 1 year later into his tenure, the Beam deal happened. And you know yourself, like you fall in love with something, you don't really want to kind of step away from that. So instead of going back to finance, I just went, well, no, let's gamble. With his section, and what he did was buy more whiskey. Beam didn't have a great deal of interest in keeping a lot of that stock. As you look back subjectively, you can see, they wanted to move from a bourbon producer into an international whiskey company, but still have, profits in the black. So they sell off the whiskey. They have production methods for Suntory, the Japanese company that wants access to distilleries around the world, because at that time, Japanese whiskey could be made from whiskey anywhere. So they were really looking interested at companies with multiple distilleries in their portfolio. Jack purchased a ton of whiskey, and then there was a good 3 years for them to find the home of what would become Teeling Distillery. There was multiple locations. They'll tell you, they were going to go to the Docklands where Google and all are now. There was, multiple locations, and originally, Newmarket, great, perfect location, 500 meters away from the Walter Teeling Distillery, the family's ancestral distillery that was established in 1782, 500 meters away, walking distance from St. Patrick's Cathedral, great, Newmarket Square, Blackpit's right behind you, really perfect location. But originally they'll tell you that planning commission wouldn't let them do it. They're like, no, you can't build a distillery there, like no chance. But it just so happened the right people got involved, and it went through. There was a TV show called Whiskey Business that they filmed them building the thing. It was not an easy process. And yeah, I mean, now it's onwards and upwards. It's always been about being inspired by the past, but forging a new future with the whiskey industry. They've had great success with it. Being now we have a big investor in Bacardi. Opening up those markets in the US and getting us more exposure on a global level. So yeah, going from strength to strength, and it really is, that a couple of guys that enjoy whiskey looking to make something of themselves.
So with that, then obviously you say there was a fair bit of stock bought from Cooley and that, so kind of almost answers probably the question I asked you earlier. So with the whiskey you're now trying to produce, or what you are now producing, are you trying to mirror a little bit of the whiskies you've already bought, or is it going to be very different to what you've already bought?
A bit of both. Yeah, a bit of both. Like the main issue for us was finding a malt component for small batch. That was the big one. Small batch being our flagship products. It's in 70, 80 markets now. It's important for us. And finding a malt component, a long-term malt component for that product was very important. So that was the first challenge, was finding something that matched the grain, that worked well in rum. I mean, that took a good couple of years, but we seem to be pretty happy with that one, or Alex is pretty happy with that one anyway. The next up was single pot still. So obviously re-establishing single pot still, broadening the horizons of the single pot still category. We want that category to one day be as broad as Scotch single malt. It would be amazing to one day have, regions of Ireland of single pot still whiskey, but obviously a pipe dream for now. The black pits really came out of nowhere. Like I said, it was part of those MPD discussions. It was something that we did, and it just popped out of nowhere. That's the thing. Like, you don't have plans in place. Like, being a flavor focused company, you can't say in 5 years we're going to release this, because if it gets to the 5 years later and it's not ready yet, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot. So again, having a single malt as part of our core portfolio from Dublin is key. But when something as special as Black Pits comes along, You kind of change tack a little bit, and yeah, we released that. But again, like releasing a core single malt will be pretty important to us moving forward. I know that's prime in Alex's mind, but again, we're not going to rush it. For that one specifically, I know it took Alex about 27 attempts to get right. To give you an example, single grain, small batch, they took about 7 attempts. Alex is quite skilled at what he does. Yeah, it took him about 7 attempts to get those right, and they haven't changed too much dramatically from each batch to batch over the last 8 years. But yeah, single malts. I remember Alex telling me a story about how they came about that one. Jack said to him, in one of their meetings, because they all, one of the best meetings you can be a part of is the MPD meeting with Jack, Stephen, and Alex, where they just taste whiskeys from the warehouse, taste different blends, and just tear them apart and go, is that good? Is that good? What about that? What about that? But I guess the plan of attack for the single malt was just create the best single malt you can. And Alex was like, okay. So at one point there was a fully matured rum single malt in there as part of the blend. It just didn't work and ended up becoming the Revival series, which is a whole different story. But yeah, I mean that combination of wine infused casks, or wine influenced casks, I should say, has really come into its own and become quite remarkable. So it won't be a simple task to come up with a replacement from Dublin distillate, but I have 100% faith in Alex that he'll do that.
I mean, we've got a couple of questions on production. So what I'll do is we'll do another section where we break into each individual whiskies and things like that. But I think Jamie had a question earlier and I've lost it. So do you want to come in, Jamie, and ask yours?
Yeah, it was about the line arms, and is it the horizontal line arms? Is that a typically Irish thing?
I mean, they are at a slight decline, but I'll be dead honest with you. They put those in, and if you're in the distillery, there was almost like an aesthetic discussion going on. So obviously there is a slight decline. I wouldn't know the angle, but you're talking very, 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 very slight. But then the aesthetics comes in and goes, I want them to be, what's the words where it's mirrored. Anyway, so there was a slight discussion around that, and then Alex came back in. But yeah, you see, depends where you go. You can see some very kind of sharp declines because we don't use that many worm tubs or anything like that in Ireland. They tend to go into condensers, and condensers have far more of a say in that regard. But it depends. I still haven't been to all the new distilleries in Ireland yet, but for the most part, they seem to have. I'm trying to think. Maybe Tullamore Dew comes down at quite a sharp decline, but no, I wouldn't say it's an Irish thing. I'd just say it's just a choice.
I think Gary had one as well now. So do you want to come in, Gary?
Hey, Robert. Just wanted to ask about obviously single pot still and mixed mash bills.
Yep.
It seems to be coming very much to the fore. Is that something you guys are doing, or are you just full malted barley?
No, of course, yeah. I mean, we love like Alex's background in brewing. We've used crystal rye, crystal malts. We've used chocolate porter. We've used obviously peated. We're going to probably try different peated levels now that we got such a response to black bits. Yeah, I mean, we love specialty malts and combinational mash bills. We did a couple for the pot still, but settled on 50-50. So 50% malted, 50% unmalted. But yeah, I mean, Alex's background with specialty malts kind of dictates a lot of that rather than, the ratio change-ups. Once he finds something that he's happy with, he tries to flesh it out to the nth degree through a distillation process. Because again, being a mid-sized distillery, you need to purchase X amount. So you want to run it a couple of times to go, okay, what was the best way to kind of draw the flavor out of the rye? Should we double distill it? Should we triple distill it? You do all the experimentations with each specialty malt, and then probably do different ratios. But there's plenty of room to maneuver there. Like, I think I always say this with some of the whiskeys, you know, it takes years to make these whiskeys before you figure out what it is as an ingredient. So then in the future, when we distill something, you're building that catalog of flavor. So in the future, when you taste something or you make something, you go, you know what, that could really benefit from that certain level of nuttiness that we've got from a double distilled chocolate porter with 10% oats. But again, like, that's going to take years and years. And what you want to do at the start, especially, you know, a new distillery, is create that control, because it's all well and good to be like a craft beer mentality, create a ton of different things, but unless you have a solid foundation to work from, you can't guarantee profitability in order to put a solid trajectory in place. Does that make sense? Like, you need to make money to spend money to do different innovations. That's what I'm trying to say.
I mean, one question that I had that I wanted to put on this section rather than the next section that we do, without going into too much about individual whiskies. You mentioned that you've sort of used roughly about 100 different cask types.
Yes.
So I'm assuming with that, you maybe you're putting in like first fill, second fill, third fills of each and things like that. But what has been the most interesting results that you've come across with different types of cask then? You know, what stood out as either been really good or really poor? Anything not worked?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be something that not worked, the way that you originally thought. I think the best two examples, though, number one was the gin cask that we did. It was a Finnish rye gin, Finnish whiskey. And we put whiskey into it, and immediately, like 2 weeks after it had gone in, it tastes like juniper, pine, hedgerow, just real green. And you're like, uh-oh, what have we done? And it was just like, okay, maybe this was a failure. Let's just leave it. But what we found was that over time, that gin influence started to dissipate, and we started to get a lot more of the wood characteristics. It didn't linger. It didn't become more influenced by gin. It actually became less influenced by the gin. So we started to see a rounding of the edges, like you see in an ex-bourbon cask, like a triple fill, a third fill ex-bourbon cask. You know, that inert kind of wood where it starts to round out the edges. It's not introducing more flavors. It's just softening what you already have. So the more interaction with those casks, the more we started to kind of appreciate it for what it was, and the more it became more like a whiskey. Yeah, Charlie, it was the hero. So yeah, 8 months or so was a lot more what we thought it would start out as, because obviously it's the reverse in, say, an ex-bourbon cask where, you know, it starts minimally influenced and then slowly gets more and more pronounced, whereas this one, you know, a complete sliding scale the other way. So that was really interesting. You know, it starts to beg the question around, you know, what is finishing? Like, could you start in something like that with an unaged distillate, get a lot of those flavors and impacts immediately, almost like botanicals, then put it into an ex-bourbon cask for 15 years? So it starts to think of that. It starts to put the ideas of, say, a reverse finish in your head. And yeah, it gets you kind of pumped. So that was impactful and a learning lesson that we appreciated. And the other one for me was the different wood types. I think one of the greatest examples that I had ever tasted for years, and I never thought it would become a product, was the Amburana cask that we did, the single malted Amburana. Amburana is a Brazilian hardwood that is normally used for cachaça. And we got our hands on some of those, and we put some single malt in. And yeah, like, I tasted it with a bunch of French bartenders back in 2016, 2017, and I was like, this is too weird. It's odd. And then every kind of year after that, I would taste it. 2019, I tasted it again. It tasted like creme brulee and liquid carrot cake. Tasted again in 2020. I'm like, it's still just super weird. Like, in terms of traditional whiskey flavors, is it something that a whiskey fan would resonate with? And I'm happy to say I was proved wrong. Like Alex and I did a private tasting, where we got a bunch of different wood type influenced whiskeys, Teeling whiskeys, and just got people to taste them and said, okay, which one do you prefer? We didn't label them. We didn't tell them what they were. Just judge it on the merits of flavor alone. And the one that won, we turned into a product, which was the Amberana single cask, the Wonders of Wood. Again, I think it was a great example of something truly different. I'm so sad for not pulling the trigger on the Wonders of Wood. Yeah, that was a good tasting. But yeah, I think that was a good eye-opening experience for, the really left of center stuff that we do. We're always nervous because, so many parts of the world still look at Irish whiskey as one green brand. And they're just so dominant that sometimes there's that fear of moving beyond, that kind of recipe or that DNA strain, or B, the DNA strain of the company that you've kind of, carved for yourself. But I think now even testing our own DNA, we're seeing a lot of success, which is great. It opens up, a plethora of flavor.
So, I mean, the one thing that has always interested me with Irish whiskey, like you mentioned earlier, its history is very checkered, and at one stage it was the best-selling whiskey in the world. It's always been up there. Then it obviously went through the slump. Where do you see Irish whiskey sitting in the market in the future? Are you expecting to get back to the dizzy heights of it being one of the best, or?
No, I mean, I don't think that. Like, I don't think when Irish whiskey was originally in its golden era, it ran unopposed. So, I don't think it'll ever get to those dizzying heights. But it would be nice to see it gain a little bit of a market share, which it is slowly. And to see every major spirits company reinvesting in Irish whiskey just reinforces that. So yeah, it'd be nice to see. I don't think we're trying to shoehorn anything beyond, a nice kind of representation in a global market in the global sense again. It's interesting to see Irish whiskey being drunk again and being so well responded to by a younger demographic. But yeah, I don't think it would just take the place of Scotch. Like that would be crazy to think. There's too many. Well, I just think there's plenty of room to maneuver within the very broad whiskey industry. I think that idea of whiskey being an old man's drink is done. I think it's far more exciting to see younger people enjoying whiskey from all over the world, including Irish and Scotch, and American and Australian and things like that. So yeah, it'd be nice to see more people drinking whiskey in general. And obviously, if a large portion of that is Irish, then brilliant.
I mean, one of the interesting things is I think Irish whiskey is very similar to English whiskey at the moment, where it's debating whether we need to have a definition of what is Irish or what is English. How do you feel on that one? Do you think we need that definition and that standardized thing, or do you think it should just be something that is allowed to progress itself?
I mean, there's a lot of debate in Irish whiskey right now about single pot still and the GI for single pot still. We could speak for hours on that. Like, I mean, we have our own unique Irish style of whiskey in single pot still, and some of us are very happy with that. And there's some that wants it to be a little more freer than it is now, not defined by percentages that suit some of the bigger companies, and instead be more aligned with historical mash bills. So like there are examples of a 33%, 30% oats, 30% unmalted, 30% malted mash bills historically, but we couldn't do that today and call it single pot still. You've got to have minimum 30% malted, minimum 30% unmalted, and a maximum 5% anything else. So that kind of puts a hamper on some of those traditional mash bills of the bygone era. But those same people are saying we shouldn't do peated whiskey, and there's historical mash bills of peated Irish whiskey. So, I mean, horses for courses. There's a lot of discussion to have for us. You know, we're just proud that Irish whiskey is growing again in popularity and in sales, and to have that unique style of Irish whiskey to draw from and experiment with, you know, gives us many years of experimentation to work with and come to the fore with something truly exciting. Yeah, there's going to be like trips and stumbles along the way, but yeah, like you said, the whiskey, or like I said, the whiskey industry is a marathon, not a sprint, and you want to, you know, make the products, make those errors, experiment. It's going to take years and years, and luckily, you know, we have the interest in the category to give us a little bit of freedom to do that. You know, it's not a struggle, which is, I think, a very positive thing that we don't stop enough at and take a look back on.
I mean, I think like some people have just commented, you know, if we bring regulations in too much, it's like opening Pandora's box, and obviously it does ruin the creativity as well, which at the moment, the Irish whiskey scene does seem to be doing some good creativity and trying to progress. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've heard a lot of people from the Teeling stable talking about you being a progressive distillery. So, you know, that's obviously where we need to stay, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example. Like for example, and I know this is a very a silly statement to make, but imagine if, you know, we just made black pits and then all of a sudden they went, okay, there can't be any more peated Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey on a global scale has to be this or this, otherwise it's getting too confusing. So like anything that falls under the Irish whiskey category can't be peated. Like, so that's the thing. Like, there are some companies that I get where they're coming from. They're doing these really cool, creamy mash bills with a large percentage of oats, but they can't even release it as single pot still. They can't even, and that's the problem. Like, to get to the hearts and minds, or to get the average consumer, not your whiskey anorak or anything like that, your average consumer, to get them to understand it, you almost need to pigeonhole it. You almost need to put it into a category. And even things like single grain are vastly, they're not really understood. So yeah, just to have something that says Irish whiskey oat distillate or something like that, you know, you're not going to get that many kind of average consumers picking up off the shelf and giving it the time that it would need to be appreciated. So it's,
I mean, one of the things sort of within there when we're talking about black pits, I know one of the members of the group today, Claire, she brought something out about peat and things like that and the sustainability of peat. So does that come into question with Irish malts, and obviously like it might do with some Scottish and things like that in the future?
I think a bigger question was Brexit. That was a big one, because we get our malts from England, well, from Scotland, sorry, I should say. That was a big concern, first and foremost. And then, yes, there's a lot of sustainability. Like, again, oak casks. You know, there's been questioning done into what is the most sustainable wood. You know, and it's acacia. Acacia is actually the most sustainable wood at present. Yeah, there's a lot of questions around sustainability that need to be answered. And luckily in Ireland, with the boom in distilleries, we all have to sign up to the government's green program. It's called Origin Green, and you need to have certain sustainability practices set in place in order to set up a distillery in current Ireland. So that's definitely a good thing. The peat question, because it happened so regular, like it was never something that we even thought about in 2019, that peat and black pit specifically would be a part of our core portfolio. So the discussions are only just happening now. You know what I mean? Like I think there was a small part of us that just assumed black pits would be, you know, a nice thing to have. And then all of a sudden it's just exploded. We're like, okay, we need to look into the long-term, planning of this new core line product that has been hugely successful, which, you know, we're appreciative of, but yeah, it means a lot more work for for people in discussions around things like sustainability of peat, the long-term sourcing of peat. You know, are Glen Est okay with the fact of us buying more and more peated malt from them? Yeah, there's a lot of discussions that have outside of just releasing a whiskey.
So with that then, and the sustainability, is there anything that sets Teeling aside from other distilleries in Ireland for sustainability? Do you do anything different? Are you planning anything in particular in the future, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that you can do just on a day-to-day level, like that. You know, working with farmers on the spent grain. There's, you know, trying not to heat water on multiple occasions. So the reclamation of heated water. So if you're using heat to run your stills, you want to use that heat somewhere else, and trying to recycle that so you save reheating. There's little things that we've looked into, like the recycling of our pot ale. So our pot ale, so the methanols and the let's just say the unalcoholic beer left in the first still, that was going, for a while, it was going to an insect farm, and that insect farm was a protein supplement for cows and feeds, but also an oil replacement. So we were looking into, you know, how these insects could become eventually a replacement for the oil industry, and that was, you know, feed for them. We're always obviously on the smaller scale of things. Obviously, it's not all grand gestures. The repurposing of old casks, obviously, you know, into furniture and things like that, as you saw in the distillery. There's also social sustainability. So giving back to the local area has always been a massive one for us. So giving to local Dublin charities, and always using local produce and suppliers. So the coffee that we use in the cafes from Cloud Picker, local Dublin roastery. We do our beer collaborations with local Dublin breweries rather than the big guys. And yeah, we work with local farmers for produce for the distillery. We have bees on the roof of the distillery that are run by Ollie's farm. Yeah, little things, you know, like the obvious ones, getting rid of stores and stuff like that. Like these things, they're just common that we don't sing and dance about them. We just do them and move on to the next thing. We did try and do one that I was personally involved in, where we tried to use spent grain to create beer coasters. That one was going well for a while, but it wasn't cost effective. It was, you know, it worked. I have them somewhere in this house. They were okay. You know, with a little bit of waterproofing, they could be great. But yeah, they were quite costly to run because it was just two lads hand making them. So yeah, it wasn't scalable. Like if I think the Dead Rabbit asked us for a few thousand, and we said we have 20. It's just like, yeah, I'm just giving it to you because I think it's cool. They're like, oh, can we get like a few thousand of these? I was like, I have 20 of them, like.